This is a recording of our Tenon Advanced training. Something to note before continuing forward on this training is that you absolutely should have taken the basic training first. And the reason why is because we're going to be going over a lot of details around using the API that are that if you don't have the basic information first, you're going to be completely lost. But a couple of things I do want to note that are going to be really important. And that is that you absolutely do have to have an account on Tenon.io to do any of the things that I'm talking about. Another thing that you will need is you will need your API key. And that is available by logging into your Tenon instance and to your account, going over to the left-hand navigation, clicking on the link that says API key. This is your API key here that's displayed in the middle of the screen. This you can click to copy to your clipboard. And another thing that you can do is you can generate a new API key here as well. Now, if you generate a new API key, your prior API key will be completely destroyed and it will be unavailable to you. So, keep that in mind. If you have an integration somewhere that relies on using your API key, that's totally fine. Just keep in mind, again, that if you change your API key, you're going to have to change it wherever you use it. And that's fine. That should be expected. A couple of other things to take note of is that this training assumes that you've already gone through things like the test settings and made sure that the test settings are set to the way that you want. If you're brand new to the system, just leave it as is. Don't spend too much time here. The next thing, though, is the API settings. This training definitely assumes that you've gone through the basic training and understood what those are. As well as you can go ahead and click on the documentation link here that says Understanding the Request Parameters. These are for API version 1, and we also have an API version 2 that we're going to discuss. So lots to unpack. Just want to make sure that you have all of this information. Now, for both of these, both the legacy API and for the new API, there is a Postman collection available. You can make use of Postman to do your thing. I'm going to go over API 1. I'm going to go over API 2. I'm going to go over Projects API. I'm going to go through all of that stuff. So, moving forward, I have Postman open right now. I do have several collections available for Tenon. Let me go ahead and close a bunch of these. There is a big difference between API 1 and API 2. And that should be noted that the API 1, very simply, you send a request to it, it gives you a response back that includes your test results. So I'm going to do that right now. Test API. Then the basic URL request is going to be the one that I send over. The endpoint there for the prod instance, the prod SaaS instance is tenonAdvancedTraining /API/index.php. Now, this one, this type of request has to be sent over as a either form data or URL form encoded. We need to have our API key put in there, and then we need to have our URL put in there. And there's another parameter called store, which is set to 1 here. Now, I don't have to set store here because my account has it set, but I'm just showing how to do this. So we're posting form data request to the version 1 of the API. I have my API key as part of the request. I have the URL as part of the request. When I send this, it's going to load the page up into the headless browser. It's going to inject our payload of JavaScript into that headless browser as well. It's going to perform all the testing, and it's going to give us our results back. Now, as you can see, in the case of CNN, CNN is notoriously slow to be tested because there's a ton of content. We have 220 something tests. We have a ton of content being tested on CNN. So it looks like the time here was 23 seconds. So that's a pretty long time. That's one of the reasons why we switched over to API version 2, which I'll explain in a bit. We get a big JSON response back, and this response structures is pretty straightforward. At the top here, we have API errors. If you get anything in this, because it is, as you can see, it's an empty array. If you get anything, any output in this, submit a support request to us. Let us know what you see there, because it should always be an empty array. Document size is just the size of the document that was tested, and that is in bytes. Next up, the global stats object. The global stats object is here, and it exists for you to sort of get a glimpse into where you stand against all the other pages that have ever been tested by Tenon. At this point, we've tested millions of URLs, so we have a couple of metrics that we can share here, such as error density, both in errors and warnings, as well as all density and the standard deviation. If you paid attention to the basic training, you'll note that the density metric is the one that we find to be most important in terms of performance. So that's why we use this in the global stats. Later on down in the response, when I go over that, what we're going to see is that we show you the density for this page, so you can compare the two. That's why we put this in there. Next up is the message, the HTTP response message. So this is 200 OK. As you can see here, that's what the API responded with as well in the headers, 200 OK. Underneath that is the request. So we're echoing back your request. Now you'll notice here that there's a whole bunch of other things in the request that I didn't actually set. The only ones that I set were the store parameter and the URL parameter. The reason why this stuff comes back is because this is part of your defaults. Remember, when you went and set up your API test settings in the UI and or in your project, you set up certain values, and those are the default values that are used whenever you don't set them. So if you don't set any of these parameters, they're going to get set for you either from your account settings or your project settings. And that's actually a good thing. It means that all you have to do is send over what you really want to send over. And so in this case, this is a convenience. Moving on down, the full response execution time. This is the actual execution time it took for testing. So as we can see here, 21.8 seconds it took to test that page. And then these other seconds here, this other second and a half or whatever is the network traffic. Response time, that is the response time in response time GMT. So that's the time it was that this request was made and came back in GMT. I'm going to go over the result set in a second, but first I'm going to skip it. The next thing at the bottom of the response is going to be a bunch of stuff like what we call the result summary. This is where we show you your density, or the page's density. So we can see here, this page's density is actually better than average, if you recall what it said in global stats. We give you the raw issue counts here in the issues object. We give you issues by WCAG level in an object here, and each level, A, AA, and AAA is its own object. Underneath that is a response URL, or I'm sorry, result URL. So if the user was to copy this and put this in their browser, whoops, that's not what I wanted to copy. Put this in their browser. Why is it not copying? Oh, Command and click. That's going to open up in the browser, and I will be able to see the results exactly as they would be had I used the API directly. And this will take a little bit of time to load. There it is. Back to Postman. Source hash is an MD5 hash of the page source when we tested it. So this will allow you, if you track the source hash, it'll allow you to know For one thing, whether your page has changed since the last time you tested it. That's pretty much how we would determine whether the page was changed or not. Now, if you're using A/B testing products like Optimizely, of course, this is probably going to be different each time, and that is what it is. Status is, as I mentioned before, the HTTP status code for the response that was set in the headers. The URL HTTP code is the status code that we got back from your URL. So what's good about that is if you try to test a page that we can't reach, the URL HTTP code will tell you possibly if you were trying to test a page that's getting a 400 level 404 or 401, something like that, or a 500 error. Client script errors is an array, and that array hopefully is going to be empty as well, because the client script errors are the any script errors that were dumped into console when we were testing. And so if there are any, then we would post a stack trace in here. That way you would know if there's any scripting errors on your page, and also if any of those existed, there might also be a case where the scripting errors had contributed to a problem for us to test. Code is just a human readable code for what this what the response was that you got back from us. Underneath that is a more info link. So if you hit this and you open up this one, it'll tell us what the code was and what status was. So in this case, of course, we have a success code, and that means, of course, that it was fine to test and everything worked out okay. Underneath that, we tell you your remaining API calls, whether they are API calls that came from your plan, or or whether they were boost calls. Either one is fine, of course. Underneath this is a log, and a log would tell us, would give us a stack trace of any problems that came from our side of things that resulted in a problem with testing. So now I'm going to go back up and I'm going to go through the result set, because this is the important part of the response. Result set is the list of test results that came back from the API. It is an array of issue objects, and each issue object has a bunch of information in it, and I'm going to go through each one of these as well. So first off, test ID is going to be the primary key ID of that test. So this one is test ID 9. And basically I know, because I know a lot of the tests, is that test ID 9 has to do with missing alt attributes for images. BP ID is best practice ID. It's not relevant in this context here, but it is actually going to contribute to the reference link. So I'll talk about that in a second. So the priority score, as you probably remember from the basics training, priority score tells us that this has 100% priority. And that, of course, is the highest priority you can have for an issue. So this is a high priority issue. Certainty, as you understood from your basic training, is how certain this test is. Error title is the title of the error. Standards is going to be an array, and that array is going to be for the applicable standards for this particular test. Result title is actually the title of the best practice that this maps to. Error description is the long form description of the error. And then viewport location is the position on the screen that this element takes up. Keep in mind that one of the important things to note about this is that it is relative to the viewport size. If you remember from your basics training, viewport size is something that you can dictate either at your account level, your project level, or the request level. So if I go back up here to the top where I go to see a request, my request was sent over at 1280 by 1024. So, given the 1280 by 1024 viewport, this is where that issue, or where that element is in context of that viewport size. The reason why I have to mention this is because if you change your viewport size, the location of certain things could change as well based on reflow, especially if you have a responsive design or something like that. We also show the position in the code itself, the line number and column number. One thing to keep in mind about the position, and this is why we don't use it in the UI, is that the position is in the rendered code. So it's not in the server-side code. If you have a whole bunch of server-side stuff going on, or a bunch of JavaScript that's modifying the page, this is not going to be the same line of code, of course, that's on your side of things. It would be the same line of code as if it was rendered into the DOM. Next up, error snippet. This is the actual HTML snippet of code that had the problem. XPath is, as you may know, is the XPath of the element when it's in the DOM. Issue ID is just a randomly assigned issue ID that we've created at runtime. So you can use this yourself for tracking, but it's going to change every time that issue is found because it's just a randomly assigned MD5. However, issue signature is important, and if you're consuming information from the API, then the issue signature is going to be really important. The issue signature is basically a couple of things. It's the error snippet, the XPath, and the test failure. Combine those things and hash those, and that's what we get for the issue signature. So the reason why this is super useful is if you test the same site and you see that there's multiple issues being returned for that signature, that means it's a duplicated issue across the site. So if we're using CNN as our example, I know that this little this little flashing red image here that's next to the words live TV. It's a little tiny red dot, and it's an animated GIF file, and it's just flashing from black to red. I know that has no alt attribute at all in the code. So imagine now you've tested 5,000 pages on the CNN site. You're going to see 5,000 instances of that. We don't ignore duplicates, we report on them, and we report on them by using that signature. Next up, as I mentioned before, the best practice page is going to be here. This is the ref link. It uses that BP ID and it uses the test ID to generate this best practice page. So we'll wait for this to load up. So this is the best practice details page, as we've seen before on our prior training, our basic training. And so that is it for API version 1 requests and understanding what those things do. Now, a couple of things we can do as well. Just want to make sure it's clear. I'm going to go ahead and bring this down and hide this. That I can always override any of my parameters. So I can turn this into certainty 0. So my project is set to 100% certainty, but I'm going to say for this test run, certainty is 0. Generally speaking, it's really not smart to override this kind of thing, just because you can set it and forget it within your project. So that's probably a smarter way to do that. But the API itself is flexible enough that you can do that. And so what we'll see here is that there's going to be a lot more issues on this page because we've ratcheted down the certainty. And so there it is. And there's much more issues. Now another thing I can do, and this should already be apparent, but I don't have to send over a URL. I can send over source. And so source would just come over as a string. So this will give me an issue for an empty heading. This will give me an issue for an image with no alt attribute. And one thing to note is that if I am sending over part of a page as my source, I want to use fragment equals 1. This is only for version 1 of the API, because version 2 of the API will be able to detect that, but version 1 cannot. So I want to tell the API that I'm using a fragment. So I hit that, get my responses back, and I see here that I have issues for missing a text alternative and for blank heading element. So you can send over source, and as a matter of fact, it's probably one of the wisest things to do is to send over source. Now that is the test API, and as I noted, there's the request parameters are put in here into the legacy API documentation, understanding Tenon API request parameters, and it shows all of these. Next up, I want to talk about the projects API. The workflow for projects is pretty awesome, and so we want to talk through the projects API. Now, the projects API is fully RESTful. In the test API, version 1 of the test API, it's not RESTful. You can only post to it, and that's that. With the projects API, you can be fully RESTful. You can do posts, gets, deletes, and puts. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to post a new project. You have to use your API key as one of your parameters, so I need to go retrieve that again. There it is. So I'm going to post a new thing. The request to post to the projects API has to include your key in the query string, and then the rest of the stuff that you're going to be doing has to do with post bodies. So you're going to send a raw post body over, and the documentation for that is going to be here in the projects API in Spider. So you go to documentation, then you click on projects API, and that is listed here. And we describe all of the request methods and the responses there. So, but that's okay. I'm going to do that now. So first thing is I want to test just a series of pages. And so that's going to be a project type of API. I got to give it a name. Name is required. So my demo project, I'll call it. Next up is a description. So you can put any description that you want in there, and then you can leave it alone. I can actually take all of these out if I wanted to, and just post it as this. However, as with everything in Tenon, you can also override any of the things that you want to do. So you can override any of the parameters just by posting them. So I can say, while my account is set to WCAG level AA, I want this one to be AAA. And my priority is, I'm going to set that to 80 in this case. So I can override anything that exists before, and that would be my project settings. So if I send this is a post request to the API, what I get back is this. So very similar to the other responses that we got out of API version 1. We give you the status and the message and the code. We give you this more info link. We give you the response time, and then we give you a response ID. The response ID is just a random ID. The request we echo back to you just like before. And then you get back this object, the project object, and this is going to tell you what the actual project is. And just like the test API, there's a bunch of things listed here that I didn't set. If you recall, I didn't set the user agent string, I didn't set the viewport height, so on and so forth. That's because these values are coming from my from my default settings. What I want to do now, though, is I want to save the project ID, because the project ID is going to be useful. For instance, if I go back to the test API and I go to the basic URL request, and I want to set the project ID here, project ID, and there we go. And I'll do easier to test page Google. There we go. Send that request using that project ID. Now that project ID was used in this request, sent to there. And as a matter of fact, if I go to my projects list now, I will see that my demo project has one total test session. That demo project test session went against that project, and it's going to show up here in my test history. And there it is. So that's really great. Now, another thing I can do is I can get all URLs in my projects. So I'm going to give it my project, my URL or my API key here. Go back and get my project ID. So this request is going to be, it's going to have the project ID in the URL. It's Tenon.io API projects / whatever your project ID is. The route here is URLs, and I have my key there. I hit send, and now I get my 200 response, and I get my project URLs. So just to refresh, what we've done is I've created a project. I tested a page as part of that project, and I've gotten the URLs from my project as well. Another thing I can do is I can get all of my projects. Pass this in. Let me get all of my projects. And so on. So let's talk about some of the structures of the things we've gotten. So when I send over the post new project, we saw that when I posted the new project, I have the project object here. And that's just for that single project that I just posted. When I go to get all projects, what I got is an array of project objects, just like that one that I saw before. So it's an array that it contains for each one of those projects the full project record as an object, and that's similar to what we saw before. Now, the other thing that I did is I can also, as I just showed, get the project URL. So I would give it a distinct project. I can get all the URLs in that project, and that's going to be an array of URL objects. The URL objects have a URL ID and the URL that was tested. I can also add URLs, and so one of the ways I can do that is I can this route here is for adding multiple URLs. Again, as before, I have to give it my key, my API key, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to post an array of URL objects. So this one already exists there at google.com, so I'm going to put this one here, msnbc.com. Now, what's great about this, by the way, is that because I'm posting these, if they don't exist already in the project, they're going to be tested. So the way to test multiple URLs with version 1 of the API, at least, is to post URLs to it. Every time you post a new URL to a project, it gets tested. So when I hit send on this, I hit send, the request comes back and is echoed back in the project URLs array here. And what happens now is that we're going to see these get added to the tests. They're going to be added to the project, and then they're going to be tested. It might take a little bit of time depending on what the queue looks like. All right. So that'll take a little bit of time, and that's fine. Another thing I can do is I can also do things like delete the project and things like that. I'm not going to worry about that just yet. Another thing I can do is I can add URLs by sitemap. So again, similar to our other workflows, we post a URL with our project ID and our API key. What happens in this scenario, and I don't have a sitemap XML file to use right now, that's an old one, is when I post this, the project's API is going to grab all the URLs out of that XML file, and it is going to test every single one of them, which is great. So let's refresh a few things that we can do so far, and we're going to do this from the context of projects. Okay, is because this will be something that we can do on a continuous basis from the API. One is post a new project and save the project ID. As a matter of fact, what you're going to be doing really is you're going to be saving what comes back in the response as the project ID. Now, after that, you can post new requests against that project ID. You're going to do it against that project using the project ID parameter in the test API. Or if you know the URLs that you want tested, you can post the URLs as an array to the route, the project URLs route. So I'll just use some template tags in here. Or to post the URLs as an XML sitemap. And that would be like this. So we have the route is described, all these routes are described in the documentation, but in this case, we're just got some template tags in there, /API /projects, project ID /URLs /sitemap, and the key. So, post a new project, save that project ID for later, post those new requests using the test API, or you can, as soon as you have that project ID, you can also post them as those URLs as an array or as an XML sitemap. So that's how you're going to use the projects API. The other ones, I'm not going to bother with delete routing and all that sort of stuff. That's pretty self-explanatory. You send a delete, you just send a HTTP delete request against the appropriate project, and it deletes it. So that's pretty straightforward stuff. Next up, we're going to talk about the Test API version 2. Now, let's talk a bit about API version 2. Version 2 of the Test API provides a couple of really important changes, and I'm going to go over some of them now. Documentation for API version 2 is listed here. When you log in and you get to the documentation page, there is a link that says API v2. On the left hand side, it just is labeled as Test API. That's because it is basically the one that we want people to start using now. Version 1 of the API will be sunsetted at some time in the future. Basically, we're planning right now on 1 year after the Test API version 2 is integrated into the user interface. As of right now, the user interface that you're using when you use the Tenon website is for API 1. API version 2 is only available if you're using your own client. So a couple of changes that are important to note between version 2 and version 1. The first one is it's no longer proxied by PHP. Now that's not a very big practical change for end users. The only difference is that there is no proxying by PHP, so this allows for a bit of an improvement in terms of speed because there is no network traffic going between two services. You're going directly to the node service when you make a request against version 2. Another difference is that version 2 is RESTful, and what that means is it accepts all get, post, put, delete, and head requests. This means that it allows you to both do your testing as well as delete test results and get test results from the past and things like that. Another big important change we're going to go through when we get started is that changes how it authenticates. In version 1, as you saw, it authenticates by the use of an API key. Version 2 is going to use OAuth, and what that means is that you have to first get a token before you submit subsequent requests. Next up is some changes in the response structure. One of the big changes is we don't post back the things that you sent over in your request. We don't send that back to you. And also the data that you get back is going to be in a data object. So everything is going to go into the data object to keep everything clean. The version 2 is going to be, those requests are going to be sent as raw JSON post bodies as opposed to the form data from version 1. Another cool feature is context. You can actually submit context to the version 2, as well as some of these other changes that are going to be here. So beyond that, there's a number of additional parameters and features that have been added that we'll talk through and that you can read through in the documentation. The other thing I do want to mention is that it's not tested immediately. So you'll recall from earlier in the video when I had posted to API version 1 that the response included all the test results, which is fine when you're doing only a page at a time. It's not fine when you're doing thousands of pages at a time. We do have customers who are doing that. So version 2, what happens is the request goes into the queue, and then you have to wait for, or you have to ping the service to get the response back. We'll talk about that in a second. I'm going to go through this now and actually show you things. So I heartily recommend reading the rest of this documentation. I believe this documentation is going to have full information in it for you, but we're going to do some of these things. So right now I'm back into Postman. Like I said, the documentation does have a link to this complete Postman collection. The first thing I need to do is I need to get my token, and to do that I need to pass in the username and password that I'm going to log in from. So I'm going to use the carlgroves@gmail account, and I'm going to just copy that value from LastPass. So I paste that in. So I'm posting this to the environment that I'm using. In this case, I'm actually going to go to the prod environment. I've saved this. In this case, in the case of the token, I've saved this this environment as a variable. So that's going to get passed around as I use the rest of the stuff. So my environment here, my prod environment, I'm going to send the request over. And I get this token. So the response comes back. It has this token, this access token. There's some other metadata that comes by, but the important thing I need is this token. It also, just so you know, the token that you receive is going to expire in 24 hours. If you re-authenticate each time, that's fine as well, but you don't need to because it expires in 24 hours. So you save this access token. You're going to need this for the rest of your requests. So the next thing I want to do is I want to post a test request. It's very similar. This is going to be a post, and there's going to be a URL version here. The body is going to accept an object. That object is going to have the URL. That URL I'm going to send over https://google.com. So I'm going to send this, and what I get back now is a 202 accepted. 202 accepted means that the request has been accepted, and our info key in this object says the request was successful, test run added to the queue. And I also get back the data object. The data object has my response ID. So when it comes time to look for these test results, then I'm going to do a get by ID. So we have this get by ID route. So as you can see, I'm running a get request against my environment, and I need to add that response ID to the query. So I add that. What has happened now is that I get a status 200. That means that the thing has been tested, and I get my results. Now let's do this one more time though, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to test CNN.com, and I'm going to post that, get that set up, and I know for a fact that CNN takes a bit of a longer time to test. So when I run this get by ID, what's going to happen is probably won't get results. I'll probably get a 202. So there you go. There's my 202. And it says the request was successful, but it's not yet tested. Now, there's a couple of things I can do. I can long poll this. Now, luckily, it didn't take long to get these results. I talked here for a couple seconds, and then I got my results, which is good. But imagine now a scenario where maybe you're sending dozens and dozens of URLs. It may take a while. It may take a while for you to get your results back. So you can long poll, or you can use another thing, which is going to be a callback URL. And callback URL is a URL that we are going to post to, and the parameter here is literally callback URL. I'm going to use webhook.site for this. Webhook.site is just it's a way that you can, well, for me personally, it's a way that I can test for webhooks to be posted. You can see here that they give you a URL that you can use to post to, and it's going to say waiting for first request. When you use a callback URL, what happens is the entire life cycle of this is going to be updated at that location. So when I hit the hit the send button here, what's going to happen? It's going to get posted to the API, and then we're going to see that happen, and then we're going to see that the API request has been resolved, and it's going to get posted there. The information posted to the webhook is going to contain all of the information that you would see from your response had you done a get by ID. As a matter of fact, the point of this of the webhook is to prevent you from needing to long poll, because it provides the exact same information that you would normally get had you long polled, but instead it's posted to your endpoint. Now, the usefulness of this goes far beyond just getting the information back. It allows you to actually do your own implementation of the Tenon product without having to replicate our infrastructure. Finally, let's take a moment to discuss the Reports API. The Reports API is by far the simplest API endpoint that you can use from Tenon. The Reports API documentation is online with the rest of our documentation. Just click on the documentation link and then the Reports link, and that will take you to a page that looks like this. This also has a Postman collection available for all the reports. Basically, the formatting for the Reports API is quite simple. You're going to send a GET request, and the GET request is going to contain two parameters. One is your API key, and then the next one is the type attribute, or the type parameter. Now, the type parameter is going to take a different type, of course, and it's a keyword depending on the type of content that you want to receive. On the Reports API documentation, there is a list of 37 different types of reports that you can get. The reports are generally oriented around two different kinds of information. The first type of information would be summary information, which, as the name would imply, gives you just a high-level summary of basic statistics. For instance, number 7 here says issues by certainty. Issues by certainty returns a response of raw number count, and as well as percentage of issues that is oriented around specific certainty buckets, as we've seen before in the reports. Now, the second type is list reports, and list reports are going to give you lists of issues. So many of these require that you supply an additional parameter, one of those being the project ID. All of the list reports do need to be narrowed down by something, and almost always that is going to be the project ID that you want the data for. So if you wanted to get, for instance, every single one of the all the data on every single project that you have, you'd want to first grab the full list of your projects from the Projects API, get those IDs, and then loop through them and get the data from them from the Reports API. Otherwise, doing that, if we were to supply you the ability to get from all projects from one endpoint, the volume of data that you would need to retrieve would be too high, and the system would not like that. So it's important to read the documentation on each different type of report that you want information from, so that you can figure out what the additional parameters might be. And again, like I said, typically it's going to be project. But there may also be certain things, for instance, where you wanted to list issues by test ID. Listing issues by test ID requires that you also have the test that you want. So listing issues by test ID requires you to supply both the test ID and the project ID. All of these, by the way, also have the ability to narrow this information down by start date and end date. And so this allows you to do things like checking on trends, checking on the status of something at a specific day or a specific time period. For instance, you can use the start date and end date to be a 24-hour difference, and that would give you what the status of something was on a specific day, things like that. To see some of this in action, I'm just going to show you the report generator. So the report generator is available via a link on the left-hand side of the Tenon user interface, and it is named appropriately Report Generator. When you land on this page, it's going to look like this. It'll have a report selector here, project selector, start date, and end date. The start date and end date are always defaulted to the most recent past 30 days. So today is April 14th. It's going to go from March 15th to April 14th, which is 30 days. And that's going to be the default date range. Of course, you can change that to be any date range you'd like it to be. So the report, as you can see here, the report selector has those summary reports and list reports sort of broken out so that it's easier for you to understand which is which. So let's say I wanted to see something like the logs by day, and because logs by day doesn't require any other parameter, I can choose to select it there. It's going to come back with the report name here. In this case, this particular report gives us a time series chart, or a line chart. And then they all, of course, also have a redundant table for accessibility purposes. The data will be presented in the table. So now the way this is presented, of course, is going to depend a little bit upon what kind of content it is. So average density, that's going to have a line chart that's going to have two lines in it, one for error density, one for warning density. Whereas density distribution is going to be a bar chart, just like the one on the dashboard. So as a matter of fact, as a reminder for those of you who have also seen the basic training, this same exact information is used, the same exact API endpoints and all that sort of stuff is used to create the dashboard reports. So just wanted to show some of that stuff. Now, issues by certainty, list issues by certainty, that's going to show you that it's going to require that you show the specific certainty and that you select a project, and then it generates that. If you need any help using the Reports API, we are glad to help you. And furthermore, if you need any additional types of data that are not being presented as part of the Reports API, let us know, because this list of 37 reports can grow to any number of different reports as needed by our customers. We have the data, we know how to get it out, so we need to know from you what is the most useful for you. And of course, telling us sort of whatever hints or tips that you want to know in order to get the data you want may result in getting a different type of custom report, and that's great. That's it for the Tenon Advanced training. As always, if you have any questions, give us a shout at support@tenonAdvancedTraining.io.